Marcus Williams stepped off the crowded bus at the military base entrance, his worn combat boots hitting the pavement with a dull thud. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the concrete, and he could feel the weight of curious stares from the other soldiers waiting in line for the security checkpoint. His uniform, once pristine olive green, now bore the permanent stains of 3 months in the field. Mud caked into the fabric, grease marks that refused to wash out, and patches of discoloration from countless nights sleeping rough in foreign terrain. The whispers started almost immediately. 2 young privates standing behind him began snickering, their voices just loud enough for him to hear. "Look at this guy," one of them muttered, nudging his companion. "Did he crawl through a swamp to get here?" The other laughed, shaking his head in mock disbelief. "Probably can't even afford a proper cleaning. Some people just don't belong in the military." Marcus kept his eyes forward, his jaw tightening slightly. He had heard it all before during his journey back to base. At the airport, fellow passengers had moved away from him in the boarding line. A well-dressed businessman had actually requested a seat change, claiming he didn't want to sit next to someone who looked like they'd been living in the streets. The flight attendant had given him disapproving looks, as if his appearance somehow reflected poorly on the airline. The security guard at the checkpoint barely glanced at Marcus's identification before waving him through with obvious distaste. "Next time, soldier, try to clean yourself up before coming on base," the guard said coldly. "This isn't a homeless shelter." More laughter rippled through the crowd of waiting personnel, and Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. He wanted to explain, to tell them where he had been and what he had endured, but he knew it would fall on deaf ears. As he made his way across the base, the reactions continued. A group of officers' wives walking their children to the playground crossed to the other side of the path when they saw him approaching. One of them pulled her young son closer, as if Marcus posed some kind of threat. "Don't stare, honey," she whispered to the boy. "Some people just don't take care of themselves properly." In the commissary, where he stopped to grab a quick meal, the cashier handled his military ID with obvious reluctance, holding it between 2 fingers as if it might contaminate her. "This is really you?" she asked skeptically, comparing his current appearance to the clean-shaven photo on the card. "You look different." Behind him in line, other soldiers continued their commentary, speculating about what kind of unit would allow someone to appear in such condition. The base barbershop fell silent when Marcus entered. 3 soldiers getting haircuts turned to stare, and the barber himself paused mid-cut. "We're pretty busy today," the barber said quickly, not meeting Marcus's eyes. "Maybe try coming back tomorrow, after you've had a chance to get cleaned up." The rejection stung more than the others because it was so transparent, but Marcus simply nodded and left without argument. Even at the base laundry facility, the attendant looked at his stained uniform with disgust. "I don't know if our machines can handle this," she said, holding up his jacket. "This looks like it's been through a war zone." She charged him extra for what she called extreme cleaning, muttering under her breath about standards and professionalism. As evening approached, Marcus found himself walking alone across the base, his temporary quarters assignment slip crumpled in his hand. Groups of soldiers gathered around picnic tables and in common areas fell quiet as he passed, their conversations resuming only after he was out of earshot. He could feel their eyes following him, could sense their judgment and assumptions about who he was and where he had come from. The irony wasn't lost on him. These same people who looked down on him with such contempt would have treated him very differently if they knew the truth about his recent assignment. But his unit's operations were classified, and he couldn't speak about the 3 months he had spent in one of the most dangerous regions in the world, living in conditions that would have broken many of the soldiers now mocking his appearance. He thought about his team, scattered to various bases for debriefing and recovery. They would understand the state of his uniform, would recognize the specific type of mud that had permanently stained his boots, would know exactly what those grease marks represented. But they weren't here to vouch for him, and he was left to face the assumptions and prejudices of people who had never set foot outside the safety of their comfortable assignments. As he finally reached his assigned temporary housing, Marcus paused at the door and looked back across the base. Tomorrow would bring more of the same treatment, more whispered comments and disapproving stares. He had survived 3 months of genuine danger and hardship, but somehow the casual cruelty of his fellow soldiers felt almost worse. At least in the field, the threats had been honest and direct. Here the hostility was wrapped in righteousness and judgment, making it harder to defend against and impossible to explain away. The next morning brought no relief for Marcus. The base mess hall buzzed with the usual breakfast chatter, but conversations died down as he entered with his tray. He had managed to wash his face and hands, but his uniform remained stubbornly stained despite his best efforts with the limited supplies in his temporary quarters. The industrial-strength detergent from the base laundry had barely made a dent in the accumulated grime from his recent deployment. Finding a seat proved challenging. Every time Marcus approached a table, the soldiers already seated would suddenly become very interested in their food or find reasons to leave. He finally settled at an empty table in the corner, but even there he could feel the weight of stares and hear the not-so-subtle comments from nearby tables. "I heard he's been living rough for weeks," whispered a sergeant to his companions. "Command should have standards about who they let on base. This isn't a charity." Another soldier chimed in. "Maybe he got kicked out of his last unit. You don't end up looking like that by accident." The speculation grew more elaborate with each retelling, painting Marcus as everything from a deserter to a vagrant who had somehow obtained military identification. After breakfast, Marcus reported to the administration building for his debriefing appointment. The waiting area was filled with other soldiers, all in crisp, clean uniforms that made Marcus feel even more self-conscious about his appearance. A young lieutenant sitting across from him actually got up and moved to another chair, making a show of checking his watch as if he had somewhere urgent to be. The receptionist, a civilian employee, treated Marcus with barely concealed disgust. "Name?" she asked curtly, not looking up from her computer screen. When Marcus provided his information, she frowned and typed aggressively. "You're early for your appointment. You'll have to wait." She gestured toward the chairs with obvious reluctance. "Please try not to disturb the other soldiers waiting." As Marcus sat down, a conversation started behind him between two captains discussing base security. "I don't understand how someone in that condition gets past the gates," one said. "What kind of message does that send about military standards?" The other agreed, adding, "In my day, you'd be sent straight to the stockade for showing up looking like that. No respect for the uniform." The wait stretched on for over an hour, during which Marcus watched other soldiers come and go for their appointments. Some had arrived after him but were called in first. When he politely asked the receptionist about the delay, she barely glanced at him. "These things take time," she said dismissively, "especially for complicated cases." The implication was clear. His appearance suggested his case would be somehow problematic or time-consuming. When Marcus was finally called in, the debriefing officer, Major Peterson, looked up from his paperwork with barely concealed irritation. "Soldier, I have to say your appearance is completely unacceptable. What unit did you say you were with?" Marcus began to explain, but the major cut him off. "I don't care what your excuse is. Military bearing and appearance standards exist, for a reason. You're a disgrace to that uniform." The major's lecture continued for several minutes, covering everything from personal hygiene to military discipline. He threatened to have Marcus written up for violations of dress code and suggested that perhaps he wasn't cut out for military service. "Maybe you should consider whether you belong in the Army," Major Peterson concluded coldly, "because right now you're not representing us well." After the humiliating meeting, Marcus walked across the base toward the supply office where he hoped to requisition a new uniform. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and his stained fatigues felt heavier than ever. A group of soldiers engaged in PT training stopped their exercises to watch him pass, their drill sergeant making a comment about maintaining military standards that was clearly directed at Marcus. At the supply office, the sergeant behind the counter looked Marcus up and down with obvious disdain. "What happened to you, soldier? Did you fall into a mud pit?" When Marcus requested a new uniform, the sergeant shook his head. "These aren't handed out for free just because you can't take care of your equipment. You'll need authorization from your commanding officer." The catch-22 was obvious. His commanding officer wasn't available, and his temporary status on base gave him limited options. Even simple interactions became exercises in humiliation. At the base barbershop, which he tried again hoping for better luck, the same barber who had turned him away the day before took one look at him and shook his head. "I told you yesterday. Come back when you're cleaned up. We have standards here." A soldier waiting for his turn looked at Marcus with disgust. "Some people just don't get it," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. The base chapel, usually a place of sanctuary and acceptance, proved no different. When Marcus slipped into the back pew for evening service, the chaplain's assistant approached him before the service began. "Excuse me," he whispered, "but we ask that everyone dress appropriately for worship. Perhaps you could come back another time when you're more prepared." The rejection in what should have been a place of unconditional acceptance felt particularly cruel. As night fell, Marcus found himself walking the perimeter of the base, avoiding the common areas where other soldiers gathered. The isolation was becoming overwhelming. He had gone from being part of a tight-knit unit that depended on each other for survival to being a pariah on his own country's military base. The irony was bitter. He had spent months protecting the very freedom and security that these soldiers enjoyed, yet they treated him as if he were the enemy. Back in his temporary quarters, Marcus sat on the narrow bunk and stared at his reflection in the small mirror. The face looking back at him was weathered and tired, marked by experiences that most of the soldiers who had mocked him would never understand. Tomorrow would bring another day of the same treatment, another day of being judged solely by his appearance, while the truth of his service remained locked behind classified briefings and security clearances. By the third day, the treatment had become routine humiliation for Marcus. Word had spread across the base about the vagrant soldier in the stained uniform, and he found himself the subject of increasing scrutiny and mockery. At morning formation, even though he wasn't officially part of any unit on base, he stood at attention while other soldiers whispered and pointed. The base commander had apparently received complaints about standards slipping and had issued a general reminder about military appearance regulations. The base fitness center became another battleground of social rejection. When Marcus entered to maintain his physical conditioning, conversations stopped and equipment suddenly became unavailable. "Sorry, all the machines are reserved," claimed a corporal who had been chatting idly moments before. Other soldiers gave him wide berths, as if his appearance might somehow be contagious. One particularly cruel group began making bets about what kind of discharge Marcus would receive, speculating loudly about whether it would be dishonorable or medical. At the post exchange, the civilian cashier actually called for a manager when Marcus tried to make a purchase. "I'm not comfortable serving someone who looks like this," she announced loudly. "How do we know his military ID is legitimate?" The manager, equally prejudiced, scrutinized Marcus's identification for several long minutes before reluctantly allowing the transaction. Behind him, a line of soldiers muttered about security risks and questioned how someone in his condition had gotten onto the base. The medical facility proved no more welcoming. Marcus had developed a persistent cough during his deployment and wanted to have it checked, but the intake nurse looked at him with open disgust. "When was your last shower?" she asked bluntly. "We maintain sanitary conditions here." She processed his paperwork with obvious reluctance, handling everything with latex gloves and making comments about certain types of soldiers who didn't maintain proper hygiene. Even the base library, typically a quiet refuge, became another source of humiliation. The librarian followed Marcus through the stacks as if he might steal books or damage property. When he sat down to read, other patrons moved to different tables. A group of off-duty officers made pointed comments about maintaining the dignity of shared spaces, and suggested that certain individuals should clean themselves up before appearing in public. The situation reached a new low during lunch at the mess hall. A table of junior officers had been particularly vocal in their criticism of Marcus over the past few days, and today they decided to make their displeasure known directly. Captain Reynolds, a young officer with an attitude that exceeded his experience, approached Marcus's isolated table with several companions in tow. "Listen here, soldier. Reynolds said loudly, ensuring his voice carried across the dining area. "I don't know what hole you crawled out of, but your appearance is an insult to every man and woman who wears this uniform with pride." The mess hall fell silent, all eyes turning toward the confrontation. "You're a disgrace, and frankly, I don't know why you haven't been court-martialed for conduct unbecoming." Marcus looked up calmly, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. "I understand your concern, Captain," he said quietly, "but perhaps you don't have all the information about my situation." His measured response only seemed to anger Reynolds further. The captain's face reddened as he leaned closer to Marcus's table. "Information? What information could possibly excuse looking like you've been living in a dumpster?" Reynolds' voice rose with each word. "Real soldiers take pride in their appearance. Real soldiers understand that the uniform represents something bigger than themselves." The other officers nodded in agreement, emboldened by their leader's display of righteous indignation. A crowd had gathered now, soldiers from throughout the mess hall forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Marcus could hear whispered encouragement for Captain Reynolds, voices telling him to put the vagrant in his place and show him what military standards mean. The hostility in the air was palpable, and Marcus realized that the situation was escalating beyond simple harassment into something potentially dangerous. "Maybe you should transfer to the reserves," suggested one of Reynolds's companions, Lieutenant Morris. "Clearly, active duty standards are too much for you to handle." The comment drew laughter from the assembled crowd, and Marcus felt the familiar heat of embarrassment rise in his cheeks. But beneath the shame was something else, a growing anger at the injustice of the situation. Marcus slowly set down his fork and looked around at the faces surrounding him. These soldiers, so quick to judge and mock, had no idea what he had been through. They lived comfortable lives on secure bases, ate hot meals every day, and slept in clean beds every night. They had never spent months in hostile territory, never faced the daily reality of life and death decisions, never had to make the kinds of sacrifices that left permanent marks on both body and spirit. "You think you know what this uniform means?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the silent mess hall. "You think appearance is what makes a soldier?" He stood slowly, his full height making Captain Reynolds take an involuntary step backward. "I've worn this uniform in places you've never heard of, under conditions you couldn't imagine." The crowd sensed the shift in dynamics, the quiet authority in Marcus's voice causing some of the more perceptive soldiers to reconsider their assumptions. But Reynolds, committed to his public stance, pressed forward. "Save your stories for someone who cares," he sneered. "Actions speak louder than words, and your actions show you're not fit to wear that uniform." Just then, the mess hall doors swung open with unusual force. The casual chatter and movement that typically filled the space during lunch hour had already died away due to the confrontation, but now an entirely different kind of silence settled over the room. Every soldier instinctively straightened, sensing the presence of senior authority even before they turned to see who had entered. The atmosphere in the mess hall shifted from hostile curiosity to tense anticipation as military bearing reasserted itself among the assembled soldiers. Even Captain Reynolds seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen, though he remained focused on his confrontation with Marcus, unaware that the dynamics of the situation were about to change dramatically. Brigadier General Harrison walked into the mess hall with the measured pace of someone accustomed to command. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his uniform immaculate, and his bearing radiated the kind of authority that comes only from decades of military service. He had been scheduled to tour the base facilities, but the commotion in the mess hall had caught his attention through the windows. The general's aide whispered something in his ear as they surveyed the scene. A crowd of soldiers gathered in a circle around what appeared to be some kind of confrontation. Captain Reynolds, and still focused on Marcus, was completely unaware of the senior officer's presence. His voice continued to carry across the now silent hall as he berated the soldier in the stained uniform. "This is exactly what's wrong with today's military," Reynolds declared, gesturing dramatically at Marcus. "Standards have become suggestions. Discipline has become optional. Look at this man. He's everything a soldier should not be." The irony of making such a speech while failing to notice a general's presence was lost on Reynolds, who was too caught up in his self-righteous display. General Harrison observed quietly for several moments, taking in not just the confrontation, but the reactions of the soldiers around it. He saw the cruel enjoyment on some faces, the uncomfortable uncertainty on others, and the isolated dignity of the man at the center of it all. Something about the soldier's bearing, despite his bedraggled appearance, caught the general's experienced eye. As Harrison moved closer, soldiers began to notice his presence. A ripple of recognition and sudden military bearing swept through the crowd like a wave. Backs straightened, conversations stopped, and the casual cruelty of moments before transformed into nervous attention. But Captain Reynolds, positioned, with his back to the general's approach, remained oblivious to the change in atmosphere. Maybe we should get him some civilian clothes. Reynolds continued his tirade, drawing nervous laughter from soldiers who were now acutely aware of their senior officer's presence. Obviously, the military uniform is too much responsibility for him to handle. Lieutenant Morris tugged on his superior's sleeve, trying to alert him to the general's presence, but Reynolds brushed him off impatiently. The general stopped directly, behind Captain Reynolds, close enough to hear every word clearly. His aide stepped forward, preparing to announce the general's presence, but Harrison raised a subtle hand to stop him. He wanted to hear exactly what was being said and how the situation was being handled by his officers. Marcus, who had noticed the general's arrival immediately due to his field-trained awareness, maintained his composure despite the ongoing harassment. His eyes met the general's briefly, and Harrison saw something there that confirmed his growing suspicions about this situation. This was not the look of a slovenly soldier or military failure. This was the steady gaze of someone who had seen serious action. In my day, Reynolds was saying, warming to his theme, soldiers who couldn't maintain basic standards were court-martialed and discharged. We didn't coddle people who clearly didn't belong in the army. Several soldiers in the crowd began shifting uncomfortably, trying to signal Reynolds about the general's presence through meaningful looks and nervous gestures. General Harrison stepped forward, his voice cutting through Reynolds' speech like a blade. Captain Reynolds. The two words carried the weight of absolute authority, and Reynolds spun around so quickly he nearly lost his balance. His face went from righteous anger to pale terror in the space of a heartbeat. General Harrison. Sir? Reynolds snapped to attention, his voice cracking slightly. The entire mess hall fell into dead silence, every soldier frozen in place. We were discussing military standards, sir. His explanation sounded weak even to his own ears, and he could feel sweat beginning to form on his forehead. I could hear your discussion from outside the building, Captain, Harrison replied coldly. His gaze swept over the assembled soldiers before returning to Reynolds. You were making quite a passionate speech about military standards and what makes a real soldier. The general's tone carried unmistakable disapproval, and Reynolds began to understand that he was in serious trouble. Harrison turned his attention to Marcus, studying him with the experienced eye of someone who had seen combat in 3 different conflicts. The stains on the uniform, the particular way it was worn, the soldier's bearing despite the harassment, all of it told a story to someone who knew how to read the signs. Soldier, the general addressed Marcus directly. Would you mind if I took a closer look at your uniform? It was phrased as a request, but everyone present understood it as an order. Marcus stepped forward without hesitation, standing at attention before the general. Harrison examined Marcus's uniform more closely, his experienced eyes taking in details that others had missed or ignored. The type of mud ground into the fabric, the pattern of wear and fading, the specific kinds of stains and damage. All of it painted a picture for someone with the knowledge to interpret it. Then the general's gaze fell on Marcus's unit insignia, partially obscured by dirt and wear, but still visible to someone looking for it. Harrison's expression changed subtly as he recognized the symbols, his eyes widening slightly with understanding. He reached out and gently brushed some of the accumulated grime from the patch, revealing more of the underlying design. Would you mind turning slightly to the right, soldier? Harrison asked, his voice now carrying a different tone entirely. Marcus complied, and the general examined the unit patch more carefully. What he saw there made him take a sharp breath. The mess hall remained absolutely silent as General Harrison studied the insignia, his face showing growing recognition and something that might have been amazement. Captain Reynolds watched nervously, beginning to sense that something significant was happening but unable to understand what it meant. Finally, the general straightened and looked directly at the unit patch, his voice clear enough for everyone in the mess hall to hear. He read the designation aloud, each word dropping into the silence like a stone into still water. The impact on the assembled soldiers was immediate and profound, as the significance of what they were hearing began to sink in. 5th Special Forces Group, Operation Mongoose Unit, General Harrison read aloud, his voice carrying clearly across the silent mess hall. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and the reaction from the assembled soldiers was immediate and dramatic. Faces that had shown mockery and disgust moments before now displayed shock, recognition, and growing horror at their own behavior. Captain Reynolds felt his knees go weak as the implications hit him. Operation Mongoose was legendary among military personnel, a classified deep reconnaissance mission that had been running for the past 3 months in one of the most hostile regions in Afghanistan. The soldiers who served in that unit were handpicked from the best of the special forces, and their mission was so dangerous that it carried a 50% casualty rate. The general continued reading from the partially visible patches and insignia, his voice growing stronger with each detail. Ranger qualified, airborne certified, combat infantry badge with 2 stars, Purple Heart with cluster. He paused, looking directly at Marcus. Afghanistan deployment patch with 4 combat stars. A collective intake of breath swept through the mess hall as the significance of those decorations became clear. 4 combat stars meant Marcus had participated in 4 major combat operations. The Purple Heart with cluster indicated he had been wounded multiple times in action. This wasn't some slovenly soldier who couldn't maintain standards. This was a decorated combat veteran who had been living in conditions that would have broken most of the people now staring at him in shock. Lieutenant Morris, who had been encouraging Captain Reynolds just minutes before, took an unconscious step backward. The soldiers who had been making crude jokes about Marcus's appearance now couldn't meet his eyes. The mess hall personnel who had treated him with disgust were staring at the floor, understanding finally dawning on their faces. General Harrison turned to address the assembled soldiers, his voice carrying the weight of command authority.
This soldier has spent the last 3 months living in caves and mountainous terrain, conducting reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines. He's eaten cold rations when he was lucky enough to eat at all, slept on rocks when he was lucky enough
to sleep, and lived under conditions that would send most of you to the hospital. The general's words cut through the silence like accusations. Operation Mongoose personnel are inserted into hostile territory with minimal equipment and no resupply for months at a time. They survive on their training, their courage, and their dedication to their mission. The mud on this soldier's uniform is from enemy territory. The stains you've been mocking are evidence of service that 99% of you will never be called upon to provide. Captain Reynolds tried to speak, his voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. General, sir, we didn't know. His appearance. But Harrison cut him off with a sharp look that silenced him immediately. His appearance, Captain, is exactly what a soldier looks like when he's been doing the job that keeps you safe while you sleep in your comfortable barracks. The general's voice carried contempt now, and Reynolds felt smaller with each word. While you've been polishing your boots and pressing your uniforms on this safe, secure base, this man has been crawling through enemy territory, gathering intelligence that saves American lives. Marcus stood at attention throughout the general's speech, his expression unchanged despite the dramatic shift in how everyone was now looking at him. He had endured the mockery with dignity, and now he endured the sudden respect with the same quiet professionalism. But those who looked closely could see the slight tightening around his eyes, the subtle signs that the past 3 days of humiliation had taken their toll. General Harrison wasn't finished. He turned back to the assembled soldiers, his gaze sweeping over faces that now showed shame instead of smugness. Operation Mongoose teams spend months cut off from civilization, with no communication except for emergency extractions. They live like ghosts in enemy territory, moving only at night, hiding during the day, eating whatever they can find or catch. The details continued to paint a picture that made the soldiers' previous behavior seem even more shameful. They can't wash their uniforms because the sound of running water might give away their position. They can't shave because the scent of soap carries for miles in mountain air. They sleep in their clothes for weeks at a time because removing them might mean freezing to death. A young private who had made particularly cruel comments about Marcus's hygiene began to visibly tremble as he understood what his words had really meant. The soldier he had mocked for smelling bad had been living in conditions where a shower was a luxury that could cost lives. The uniform he had laughed at told the story of months of unimaginable hardship and sacrifice. General Harrison looked directly at Captain Reynolds, who was now standing rigidly at attention but sweating profusely. "Captain, you spoke eloquently about military standards and what makes a real soldier. This man represents the highest standard of military service. Volunteers who accept missions that most soldiers pray they'll never be asked to undertake." The general paused, letting his words sink in before delivering his final point. "The irony, Captain, is that while you were questioning this soldier's fitness for duty, he was returning from a mission where his team gathered intelligence that prevented an attack on this very base. The comfortable security you enjoy, the hot meals you eat, the clean beds you sleep in, they're all possible because soldiers like this one are willing to sacrifice everything, including their comfort and their health, to protect you." The silence that followed was deafening. Every soldier in the mess hall understood that they had witnessed something significant, and most of them were beginning to comprehend their own roles in what had transpired. The man they had treated as a pariah was actually a hero, and their behavior toward him reflected poorly not just on them individually, but on the entire military community. Marcus continued to stand at attention, waiting for permission to move, his bearing unchanged despite the complete reversal in how everyone was now viewing him. The transformation in the room was palpable. Mockery had turned to respect, disgust had become admiration, and judgment had transformed into shame. General Harrison wasn't finished with his lesson. He turned to address the entire mess hall, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak about military service. "I want everyone here to understand something," he began, his gaze sweeping over the assembled soldiers. "What you've witnessed over the past few days isn't just poor treatment of a fellow soldier. It's a failure of military values at the most fundamental level." The general gestured toward Marcus, who remained at attention. This soldier volunteered for one of the most dangerous assignments in the military. His team operated for 3 months without backup, without regular communication, and without the safety net that the rest of us take for granted. They accepted a mission that military analysts predicted would result in heavy casualties, and they did it because the intelligence they could gather would save lives. Captain Reynolds stood, frozen, understanding that his career had likely been irreparably damaged by his public display of ignorance and prejudice. The other officers who had encouraged him were equally stunned, realizing they had aligned themselves with the wrong side of a situation that would be remembered and discussed throughout their careers. "But the real failure here," Harrison continued, "isn't just the treatment this soldier received. It's what that treatment reveals about our military culture. Too many of you were willing to judge based on appearances, to assume the worst about a fellow service member, and to participate in or tolerate behavior that goes against everything we claim to stand for." The general paused, letting his words sink in. Military bearing isn't about having a perfectly pressed uniform. It's about maintaining your dignity and professionalism under any circumstances. Discipline isn't about following rules when it's convenient. It's about doing what's right even when no one is watching. Honor isn't about looking good. It's about being good. Marcus finally received permission to speak when the general asked him directly about his mission. His voice was steady and professional as he provided a brief, unclassified summary of his team's activities. "We were tasked with monitoring enemy supply lines in the Kunar province, sir. My team spent 12 weeks observing and reporting on insurgent activities in the region." The simple statement carried enormous weight. Everyone in the room knew that Kunar province was one of the most dangerous areas in Afghanistan. Supply line monitoring meant staying close enough to enemy positions to count trucks and weapons shipments, a task that required living rough in hostile territory for extended periods. As Marcus spoke, more details emerged that painted an even clearer picture of his sacrifice. His team had been inserted by helicopter in February, during the worst of the Afghan winter. They had survived temperatures that dropped below freezing every night, with no heat source that wouldn't reveal their position. They had carried only the most basic equipment, leaving behind anything that wasn't absolutely essential for survival and mission completion. We maintained observation posts in caves and rocky overhangs, Marcus continued when asked for details. Movement was restricted to night hours, and even then only when absolutely necessary. The enemy controlled all the roads and most of the valleys, so extraction wasn't possible until the mission was complete. The soldiers listening began to understand the full scope of what Marcus had endured. 3 months in enemy territory, living like a ghost, eating cold food when food was available at all, drinking water from mountain streams, and never knowing from one day to the next whether they would be discovered and killed. General Harrison used the moment to drive home his lesson. While this soldier was risking his life for his country, gathering intelligence that has already prevented multiple attacks, some of you were comfortable enough in your safe assignments to mock his appearance. The disconnect between sacrifice and appreciation has rarely been more clearly demonstrated. The mess hall personnel who had treated Marcus poorly approached hesitantly to apologize, their earlier disgust replaced by genuine shame. The cashier from the post-exchange appeared, having heard about the situation, to offer her own apology and to comp his previous purchases. The barber arrived to offer free haircuts and grooming services, though Marcus politely declined, explaining that he still had several days of debriefings before he could return to normal grooming standards. Captain Reynolds finally found his voice, though it came out weak and uncertain. "Soldier, Sergeant Williams, I owe you an apology. My behavior was inexcusable and I—" But Marcus cut him off politely. "No apology necessary, Captain. You reacted based on the information you had. I understand." The grace with which Marcus handled the situation impressed even General Harrison. This soldier, who had every right to be angry and resentful, was showing more class and professionalism than the officers who had humiliated him. It was a final lesson in